Welcome to class. Last class, so on Wednesday, we talked about the Industrial Revolution, we looked at child labor, and we looked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And then we introduced the idea of the jungle by Upton Sinclair. And I told you guys a little bit about just it was a book written in this time period, and now we're going to look a little bit more closely at that. So we didn't agree, disagree, and I asked you about if you would quit a job if the job didn't treat you right, and then also about the importance of knowing where your food came from. So we're going to watch a short video clip to introduce the jungle and some of the issues there.
The Industrial Revolution of the 1800s had a dramatic effect on economic and social life around the globe. The economies of industrializing nations shifted from agriculture to manufacturing, from rural to urban. Thanks to innovations in technology, energy production, and manufacturing, factories churned out large quantities of new products at lower prices. Almost overnight, cities swelled to support new industries. Soon, people were flocking to the growing cities, looking for work and a better life. But factory life did not live up to its promise. The workers had few rights. Wages were low, hours were long, working conditions were often unsafe, and unemployment or worse was always just an accident away. These harsh working conditions were common at the turn of the 20th century. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel about the American meatpacking industry.
At the time that The Jungle was written, the plants were horrible places to work. They were full of violence, they weren't clean, and frequently diseased and dead animals were slaughtered and made into food.
Sinclair's novel follows the story of a young Lithuanian, Jurgis Rudkus, who arrives in America seeking freedom and opportunity. He finds work in a prosperous and, as he learns to his dismay, filthy Chicago meatpacking plant.
Think about an individual coming from a rural agricultural kind of society, whether you think about Jurgis coming from Lithuania or a black migrant coming from the deep south, Mississippi, coming into a large industrial city, working in a mass production industry like meatpacking. Sinclair was writing on the crust of a giant wave of social and economic change that took place in the course of the late 19th century.
Before writing The Jungle, Sinclair spent 7 weeks around Chicago's meatpacking plants. He studied details about the work itself, the home lives of workers, and the structure of the business.
Upton Sinclair went into the plants and he saw dead animals being slaughtered. He saw filth all over the plant. He saw products going into sausage that shouldn't have been there. But more importantly, he came out of the plant radicalized by what happened to the workers, how they got chewed up the same way the food did.
Sinclair used the horrors he witnessed as the basis for Jurgis's fictionalized story. As Jurgis discovers, work in the plant involves back-breaking labor in unsafe conditions. When a worker becomes ill or gets injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him. Workers in the pickling room have their fingers eaten by acid. Cooks live in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that permeated also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up to shoot in the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
When The Jungle was published, there was a public outcry. Americans were outraged, and they urged the United States Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. More federal laws followed that prevented packers from adding fillers and impurities to meat. And the United States Department of Agriculture inspectors were put in every meat plant in the country. But this wasn't the reaction that Sinclair was looking for. He wanted to help the workers. "I aimed at the public's heart," he wrote, "and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." It took decades to improve the working conditions Sinclair criticized in The Jungle. The changes came from inside the factories themselves, from members of labor unions making demands of the factory owners. The Jungle's pro-worker viewpoint may have been lost on the public at the time, but its powerful message is clear today.
Welcome back. So it's kind of morbid, but very, very interesting as well. Upton Sinclair wrote this book to really bring to light the issues of the workers in the meatpacking industry. Okay, they were facing these horrible, horrible conditions, but fortunately, but unfortunately for him, he really impacted the food industry more. So as people read this book, they were appalled by the conditions in which their food was being treated. Sick animals were being ground into meat. Sometimes rats would fall into the vats and it would still be sent to people. Rotten meat was repurposed and repackaged and sold as specialty meat and all of these things, and people had no clue that it was happening. The chemicals that were going into their food, all of these things. So even though people didn't really rally around the workers because of this, they did rally around food regulation, and this really developed into the FDA, so our Food and Drug Administration, and better labels about where our food comes from, more transparency in the food industry. So some good things did come from it. Part of the Industrial Revolution and exploring this topic is going to take us into what is called imperialism. And you can't really study imperialism or the Industrial Revolution without studying Great Britain. So we're going to watch a documentary called Engineering and Empire on Great Britain. It is fabulous. You will have some questions in your exit ticket asking about engineering and empire. So enjoy.
England, once dominated by Roman conquerors, this tiny island nation rose to become one of the largest and most powerful empires in history. Its reach stretched around the globe, spanning every continent.
It was unimaginably large.
Technology, innovation, ambition, these were the tools that built this massive empire and produced the formidable British Navy, a powerhouse that dominated the world's oceans.
The Royal Navy is like the Microsoft of the global system in the 18th and 19th centuries. They are everywhere.
The British Empire constructed massive symbols of dominance that still invoke awe today. But the foundations of that empire were built on ego, bloodshed, and a relentless drive for conquest. AD, the most powerful empire the world had ever known is under attack. At the far edges of the British Isles, the once mighty Roman legions march toward the coast in full retreat. They leave in their wake a military and political void. For the first time in more than 400 years, the vulnerable island nation of Britain must fend for itself. It was the end of one empire and the beginning of another.
The sun never sets on the British Empire. I've heard those words all my life, ever since I was a kid, even though I've never lived in England, and that empire is long gone. Hello, I'm Peter Weller. At its height, the British Empire covered almost a quarter of the Earth's land mass, some 14 million square miles, and if you think about that, that's just staggering. But how did an island, if you will, in the middle of the North Atlantic come to be such a behemoth empire?
By this time, England was growing rapidly into a superpower, based on the supremacy of its naval engineering. But it would be another realm of technical superiority that would catapult the British Empire to global dominance. The 19th century was about to usher in a period of engineering invention not seen since the Romans. The Mary Rose sank in a battle with the French in 1545. In 1982, the ship was raised from the bottom of the sea. By the 19th century, Britain had developed into an industrial titan, bursting with wealth. Its monumental success came from a period of staggering technological invention that swept across the empire and then dominated the globe.
It's hard to think of a period in history where you had so much creativity in terms of technology, so much willing to experiment with the possibilities of what you can do with machines, what you can do with engineering, what you can do with architecture.
In the past, empires had been built by hand. Now the British would dominate their territory with machines.
Engineering innovations like cast iron and the turning of a warship into a single ballistic offensive entity with guns transformed the English Navy. And that Navy transformed England into an empire. And that military and commercial empire that spread from Europe to Asia, from the Americas to Africa, dominated the seas. But what about the land? Because by the early 1800s, Britain was jumping with productivity, but lacking in means of overland distribution. Well, in 1782, a man named James Watt perfected an engine driven by steam. But it was 40 years later that George Stephenson and his son Robert took that engine and with a firebox, boiler, piston, and a remarkable invention called the chimney, powered a locomotive called the rocket over tracks at the blistering speed of 29 miles an hour and revolutionized overland commercial transportation with the railroad.
The rocket was not the first locomotive, but its unique engineering features proved that steam trains were the force of the future. The key to its speed was in its engine. A series of copper pipes carried hot gases from a coal-fueled firebox through a chamber of water, bringing it to a boil. This created steam that rose up into a dome and was forced through a valve into a cylinder. The intense pressure from the steam pushed a piston rod that connected to the wheels of the locomotive, powering it forward. By venting the exhaust steam out of a chimney instead of the cylinder, fresh air was sucked into the firebox, stoking the fire. With this advance, the rocket could charge ahead at blazing speeds.
Of all the locomotives that were imagined at the time, it's the one that looks the most like a locomotive will. I mean, it's going to be improved in innumerable ways, but that basic machine is the one that emerges as a locomotive for the next century.
The race was on to build railroads across Britain. And in 1833, a brilliant and brash engineer rose to prominence when he entered the railroad game. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Brunel was a real showman. He dressed well, he had a beautiful wife. He was a celebrity, and he knew how to play that to a hilt. He was also a workaholic. He had a very difficult time delegating.
Brunel had a bold vision for his railway. It would be the most ambitious project to date, a massive network of railroads connecting all of England together. He called it the Great Western Railway, and he was determined to make it the fastest line ever created.
He wanted a track which was on a very, very shallow gradient so that the trains would be able to travel that much faster.
The need for speed meant going through mountains rather than over them, and this led to his greatest engineering marvel. Today, it is known as the Box Tunnel.
It was necessary, essentially, to chisel through rock, and the length of the tunnel was something like 1 3/4 miles, which was really astonishing for this time. That's a really serious tunnel, even by today's standards.
Brunel amassed hundreds of Irish workers called navvies to dig the tunnel. They began by sinking a series of shafts from the top of the hill. Gunpowder was used to blast through the rock. Then the navvies were lowered in baskets down the shaft, where they excavated the materials with basic hand tools. Horses turned winches that pulled the material to the top of the hill.
It was a slow, painful, and sometimes quite a dangerous process, of course. And there were fatalities on the Box Tunnel during its construction. Lots of dust, lots of grime, and when the explosions were going off, the risk of flying rock.
After 4 years of work that claimed more than 100 lives, the Box Tunnel was finished. The Great Western Railway finally opened in 1841. Trains still run through the Box Tunnel to this day. The railway mania that Brunel helped ignite eventually spread to the rest of the empire, tightening England's stranglehold on power around the world.
Railways in the middle of the 19th century, first in England and then wherever they spread, they're sources of just incredible wonder. They're big, they're loud, they're dirty, and they're just power. And they represent speed, they represent the conquest of space and time. They're literally awesome machines.
With the runaway success of the railway, Britain was now decades ahead of the rest of the world in modern engineering technology. Their empire was fast approaching its apex. But a staggering blow to its nerve center would rattle the empire to its very foundations. The first person to be killed by a train was a member of Parliament. He was struck by the rocket in 1830. October 1834. In the dark of the London night, a violent fire rages through the very heart of the British Empire, Westminster Palace. For centuries, this complex of buildings had been the command center of British power and a towering symbol of its strength. Now, as flames turn the palace into a roaring inferno, thousands watch in shock and horror, wondering what will become of their mighty government.
The fire of 1834 had dealt a devastating blow to the political nerve center of the British Empire. Westminster Palace had stood in some form or another since the late 11th century during the time of William the Conqueror. And now these ruins had the British people wondering, would Parliament ever meet again in this place? Would Parliament ever rise and vote again in these magnificent buildings that had given birth to the modern political process? Well, a royal commission was appointed to decide this very thing, and the royal commission decided, yes, Parliament would be reconstructed in this place. But now a more difficult question came up. What would these buildings look like? Would they be neo-Gothic, French, Italian, or English? Or would they be the perpendicular style of Elizabethan Tudor or English Renaissance? A sort of a civic war happened for 2 years until 1836. The Royal Commission, over 97 proposals, chose the plan of a man named Charles Barry, who was a fan of the Italian Renaissance, but he combined those elements with neo-Gothic, and he gave us this. The Houses of Parliament we have today, a sort of a mishmash of styles, but a stunning mishmash nonetheless.
From the ruins of the old Parliament, British architects would design a government building of staggering proportions, twice the size of the U.S. Capitol. Constructed of sand-colored limestone called Anston, the palace would take up 8 acres of land, with towers soaring as much as 320 feet into the sky. It was decided that one of these massive structures would be a grand clock tower. Today, we know it as Big Ben.
You're able to measure time much more accurately in the 19th century, and time is important. Time comes to mean money, and there's something of a revolution in the 19th century about timekeeping. So if you're going to have this latest building, yeah, a clock tower goes on it.
When the royal astronomer George Airy announced his requirements for the clock, people were stunned. It would be the largest and most ambitious timepiece the world had ever seen.
Now, Airy's demands for excellence were fairly rigorous. For instance, one of his requirements was that the clock be accurate to within 1 second every 24-hour period, and furthermore, that the accuracy reports of this clock be telegraphed on down the River Thames to the Greenwich Observatory twice a day. Now, this was not the 21st century age of information. A digital clockmaker today, this would not be shooting for the moon. But a 19th century clockmaker, to make such a great clock in a huge tower with such heavy striking mechanisms, pushing such heavy hands, with such precision and such accuracy, that would be exposed to the rain, wind, and elements second after second, hour after hour, week after week, year after year. This was absolutely unimaginable. It was like going to the moon. So Parliament, rightfully, asked Airy if he might come up with a plan that was a little bit more reasonable, a little less expensive. But Airy was adamant. And thus the clock today we call Big Ben, which is really the name of the bell, became the standard for timekeeping the world over.
Incredibly, it was an amateur clockmaker by the name of Edmund Beckett Denison who designed the famous clock when all other experts failed to meet the challenge of pinpoint accuracy. Like all clocks of this type, Denison's would be powered by weights, gears, and a pendulum. But Big Ben's design featured a groundbreaking new device that would protect the pendulum from outside forces. Two metal arms control a wheel with 3 spokes. With each swing of the pendulum, one of the arms opens, allowing the wheel to turn a notch. This regulates the movement of the clock. When rain or snow weighs down the clock's hands, the arms isolate the pendulum so it keeps swinging without being affected. To fine-tune the clock's accuracy, timekeepers simply reach into their own pockets.
Pennies are used as part of its regulating its accuracy. By adding or taking away one of these old pennies from the pendulum, the clock can actually gain or lose 2/5 of a second in 24 hours.
With this brilliant but simple method, the clock became world famous as a marvel of precision engineering.
The clock tower over the Parliament at the centre of the empire has a peculiarly powerful symbolic importance. It's as if time itself is governed by the British.
In addition to the clock, a series of bells was needed to toll the passing time, with an enormous central bell ringing on the hour. A bell founder by the name of George Mears cast the giant bell to Denison's precise specifications, and Big Ben was born, weighing a staggering 13 tons. Huge crowds lined the streets of London and cheered as Big Ben was transported to the finished clock tower in 1858. It has been filling London with its distinctive rings ever since.
London grew as a city tremendously. It was really the first large-scale conurbation in the world. And as a city, it had to have its icons, and the ultimate icon being the mother of parliaments, the parliamentary building with Big Ben as a symbol of the strength and the power of the British Empire.
By the mid-19th century, Great Britain had set the gold standard for technological achievement. But under the reign of a young, naive queen, a crisis would strike London and push it to the brink of disaster. A flock of birds landed on the minute hand of Big Ben in 1949 and set the time back 5 minutes. In 1837, a teenage girl takes the reins of the most powerful empire on Earth. Her rise to power ignites turmoil throughout Great Britain. Both her subjects and her government view her as spoiled, impetuous, and unprepared to rule. Her name was Queen Victoria.
She was only 18 when she came to the throne, and she'd had a very, very difficult first couple of years on the throne, and in fact was very unpopular.
There was little to indicate this immature girl would grow up to become a revered symbol of the empire's immense power. Her transformation started when she married her cousin Albert in 1840.
She fell in love almost at first sight. All her life, actually, she wants someone to lean on, metaphorically and indeed literally. And Albert is able to take her in hand, rather. So he comes in and he helps her grow up.
By this time, the empire stretched around the world, from North America to Australia. Albert and Victoria pushed for greatness in engineering and technology, knowing how crucial these advances were to their expanding empire. None more so than the emerging technology of the telegraph.
You've got an empire which is extending literally around the globe. People talked about the annihilation of space and time through electrical telegraph.
The telegraph industry exploded around the world, with Britain leading the charge. During the mid-19th century, over 97,000 miles of twisted steel telegraph cables were laid. A message could now be sent from Britain to India in a matter of hours. The world's first information superhighway had arrived, and with it, the empire could consolidate its power more effectively than ever before.
It was an enormous feat, no question. It's something which simply was not conceivable before they did it.
Engineering advances not only united the empire, they triggered a manufacturing boom unlike any seen before. People flocked from rural areas to city centers to take advantage of job opportunities. And as productivity skyrocketed, so did the population of its nerve center, London.
So whereas it had been 1 million at the beginning of the 19th century, it was then, by the 1850s, it was already 2 million. And London was not designed for this. And there was terrible overcrowding. Really, people were living like as though they were in a chicken coop.
London was bursting with people. Cramped and overcrowded, sanitation problems spread like wildfire. Waste flowed into sewers meant only for rainwater, filling it with raw sewage that emptied directly into the Thames River. The situation was ripe for disaster.
Now, you would think the Thames, huge river, that would be a great way of disposing of London's waste. But unfortunately, it was also London's water supply. So the waste of 2 million Londoners was being shunted into the Thames, and then Londoners were actually drinking this.
1848. Catastrophe strikes London. A cholera epidemic sweeps through the congested city, killing more than 14,000. 3 years later, another outbreak occurs, claiming an additional 10,000 victims. Cemeteries fill up with bodies. The most advanced city in the world faced conditions that had not been seen since the Black Death of the Middle Ages.
In the space of 30 years, over 30,000 Londoners died, and this was because of cholera, and because cholera was spreading through London's polluted water supply. It was shocking.
Something needed to be done. England turned to an engineer by the name of Joseph Bazalgette. His solution would revolutionize urban planning. He and thousands of city workers would build the most advanced sewer system to date. Bazalgette's innovative plan was to install giant intercepting sewers on each side of the Thames, running parallel to the water. These main pipes would be connected to more than 1,300 miles of older city sewers, collecting the waste and diverting it away from the river.
The genius of the system was that gravity was used wherever possible to actually move the sewage out of London. So the sewers actually ran at an incline.
When gravity wasn't enough to carry the flow, Bazalgette built grand pumping stations. There, large steam-driven engines lifted the sewage until gravity could take over once again. The sewers guided the waste into 2 deep reservoirs, where it would be stored and released at high tide, when nature could dispose of it neatly.
The sewer system really was one of the marvels of the 19th century. It used 300 million bricks. There was extraordinary earth moving. It was a truly colossal task and brilliant, amazing.
This extraordinary engineering feat transformed London into the first modern glittering metropolis. Cities throughout Europe studied its design with awe. But the disease epidemic wouldn't be the last crisis of Victoria's reign.
If you read Hard Times or Oliver Twist or David Copperfield or any of the other genius works by Charles Dickens, you'll get a sense of the staggering overpopulation in London in the 19th century. And some of the fallout of this horror was the sheer volume of traffic in London, a chaos of pedestrians and horses and carriages and carts hauling everything from hay to hardware. The traffic from the south alone was bottlenecking the London Bridge such that London felt like it was choking to death on its own success. London needed another river crossing, but a traditional bridge would block the big merchant boats coming upriver to the port. No, what London needed was a drawbridge, like that one.
The drawbridge would be the largest and most sophisticated of its kind. It would be called the Tower Bridge. The structure is solid steel covered in stone to make it look like the nearby Tower of London. When the bridge was built, the 1,200-ton leaves, or bascules, were lifted by steam-driven engines. The power turned toothed pinions along a curved steel rack riveted to the outside girders. A solid pivot rotated as the pinion raised the structure. The bascules lifted to an 83-degree angle, allowing ships to pass through.
The rising of the bridge only took 1 minute to raise it, so it was an incredible feat of engineering.
It took more than 400 men and 8 years to build Tower Bridge. Today, it is one of the most famous and recognizable bridges in the world. Despite being the driving force behind these staggering works of engineering, Albert didn't live to see them. He died in 1861, shattering Victoria.
Queen Victoria fell into grief the like you have never seen.
For close to 10 years, Victoria sat in isolation from her country. But when she finally re-emerged into public life, she was stronger and more powerful than ever before. The immature teenager had redefined herself into a ruler of the modern age and took her rightful place as leader of the British Empire.
All over the world, statues to Victoria are erected. There are massive celebrations all over the world, and in many cases, those celebrations are joined by the colonized peoples. She becomes a figure of affection.
Victoria had become the symbol of the empire's splendor and might, and her reign would mark the apex of British power around the world. The British Empire now had possessions on every major continent and could claim more than 400 million people under its rule. No other country could rival its immense power. It was the largest empire the world would ever see.
Queen Victoria died in 1901 at the dawn of the 20th century. She presided over a realm as large, as optimistic, confident, and as innovative as any in history. The British Empire had dragged mankind smashing into the modern age with mass production, rapid transit, and communication. The world would never be the same. Every single country and culture on this planet today has benefited in some way or another from British vision and imagination. The sun may have finally set on the British Empire, but regarding the miracles of the modern age, the sun never burned brighter. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Weller.
As a quick reminder, due today you have your exit ticket 11/16/18. You have your 3.07 checkpoint. You're going to use chapter 26 in the textbook for that. Also look at the lesson answer key for 3.07. Due Monday, you have an Imperial and Resistance Shape the Modern World reading quiz. There's a reading and the quiz. You can have the reading open as you take the quiz. Okay? I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend.